Okay. Один, два, три. Добрий день. Всі чують гарно? Так? Всі? Добрий день. Вітаємо вас від імені Канадсько-Української мистецької фундації. Від імені дирекції фундації. I welcome you today to this beautiful gallery where we have today the exhibit of the fall exhibit of Ukrainian Artists Association. And we have an honor today to have in our gallery author, modern thinker, artist as well as a journalist, Vladislav Davidzon. Vladislav Davidzon is the European culture correspondent at Tablet magazine, a fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and the author of From Odessa With Love, political and literary essays in post-Soviet Ukraine. He is the founder and chief editor of the Odessa Review. He is a contributor to Foreign Policy magazine and the opinion section of the Wall Street Journal. He studied human rights law in Venice. Is it Venice, Italy?
Yes.
Oh, wow, lucky you.
Wonderful.
Okay, and today Vladislav brings to us his newly published edition, Jewish-Ukrainian Relations and the Birth of a Political Nation. It's a collection of his latest articles, like for the last 10 years. And the introduction to this great collection was written by the modern and contemporary French philosopher Henri Bernard Lévy, which I loved. I love this introduction.
It's very fun.
Yeah, very, very nice. So before I call Vladislav to the microphone, I would like to ask Halyna Kostyuk, literary critic, to introduce Vladislav's literary work at length to our audience. Thank you, Halyna.
Thank you, Uliana. Thank you, everyone, for coming. At length, it was generally said. I am not intend to speak at length here because we came to communicate, to talk with our guest, author, Vladislav Davidzon, whose book is already stirring much attention among people interested in contemporary Ukrainian affairs and Jewish-Ukrainian relations. Vladislav Davidzon is an author, publisher, an artist, a journalist focusing on post-Soviet affairs. He published and edited an Anglophone journal, the Odessa Review, with an emphasis on cultural life in Odessa. This city takes an important part in his life, both personal and cultural, since Odessa is his wife's hometown. And he was working in this city for a long time, was pouring his creative energy in it, and his novel From Odessa With Love is a very important work. So it takes time and energy to what Vladislav is shows his admirers, his followers, that this city is important for him. Davidzon serves as a fellow with the Atlantic Council at the Eurasia Center. He's also a gifted collage artist, which is, we would love to see it. I'm sure you have it, any of your scrapbooks with you.
I don't have any.
No.
That's going to be our next event. With
Yeah, it should be.
There are Tablet magazine reproduced some of my work, some of my war collages. So that's on the internet if you're interested.
Yeah, it would be very nice to see. Jewish-Ukrainian Relations and the Birth of a Political Nation contains selected essays in a time span from 2013 till 2023. The essays are dynamic and easy to digest. The recent events correspond with the ones that happened a long time ago. The contemporary affairs are tightly interwoven with an ancient history in the most surprising ways. Davidzon skillfully engages the readers and makes them participate, if only intellectually, in the events he is writing about. Vladislav Davidzon is a man of culture. Even he is writing about politics or recent events that everyone is interested in. Still, the main focus on everything he's doing is underlining matters of everything he's writing is culture. In the introduction to this book, you will have chance to see and read very soon. Bernard-Henri Levy noted that when Vladislav was in Ukraine, in a very close to front, I think, he was engaging the General Kovalchuk in a discussion about decline of literary criticism, about the press crisis in the United States. And when I was reading that, I was very interested. Was it a seriously pressing issue at the time to discuss, or it just Vladislav cannot help himself? The culture is really something that interests him deeply, and even in a moment of danger, in a moment of other pressing matters, he still is focusing on culture. He still wants to engage other people in a discussion about it. So I will not take any more time of yours, and I will let you to talk directly to our guest and ask him everything you want.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for a lovely discourse and invitation. Everyone can hear me, right? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I often get told that I'm very loud in restaurants and business lounges and airports, so it happens. So I will maybe I'll just talk into this thing or not.
We wore earplugs.
Thank you so much. It is true that I was profiling General Kovalchuk, who was then the commander of the Southern Front. We're at the Battle of Kherson, and we were getting bombed, and has to pass the time. So his bodyguard and I and the general, we were just passing the time and hanging out, and we were discussing our backgrounds, and then I explained to him how I started my life as a journalist out as a literary critic, and then I was just explaining to the general, and in retrospect, it is surreal conversation to have, literally as they're bombed. It was literally 2 kilometers from the front that were getting bombed by the Russians right before our side took back Kherson. It was a surreal conversation to have, but we were discussing the decline of literary criticism, book reviewing in North America. You can't help yourself, but also you have to talk about something, and you talk about the literary criticism on the Okop in the dugouts. Thank you, Kup, for having me, and thank you, Raya, and the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter for arranging this encounter. So, just a little bit about myself, because, it's my book, but also my background in terms of a diaspora is not an ordinary one. No life is ordinary, and everyone has their own path, but my path back to Ukraine, which is my grandparents' country, is not a very, I wouldn't say it's unique, but sociologically it doesn't fit into many of the boxes that some of you will fit into as Ukrainians who are immigrants here, or Canadian Ukrainians, I come from the other diaspora. My grandparents were born in Ukraine. One of my grandmothers was born actually in, she became a citizen of SSSR, Ukrainian SSSR, when Chernivtsi passed over from the Romanians to the Soviets. So my grandmother actually was born in Romanian interwar Chernivtsi. Obviously, this was Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it then became for about 18 years Romania between the two wars, and then it became Ukraine because the Soviets took that part of Poland and Romania. We all know the history. I'm not going into it. Another part of my family is from Poltava, and from I have some ancestry from Venice. So basically, my grandparents are Ukrainian Jews. This is where we lived, and in Belarus for hundreds and hundreds of years. It just so happened because my grandparents were in a nomenclatura family. We were evacuated out to Uzbekistan. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Belarusian Jews were evacuated out to Uzbekistan. My grandparents stayed there, and my parents were born there, and I was born there at the tail end of Perestroika. So I'm a Perestroika baby, born in Uzbekistan, but from the diaspora. We went to Moscow in '89 when all the Ukrainians and Russians and Jews were leaving. Uzbekistan was obvious; it was time to go in '89, '90. Everyone was leaving. There was not really anything for Ukrainians or Jews or some other diasporas. Korean or Russian also left. It wasn't a time to stay there. So we went to Moscow for about 18 months while we were waiting for the paperwork to arrive so we can immigrate to America or Israel. The paperwork arrived. As it happened, my father, again connected to nomenclatura stuff, put us on the very last flight out of the Soviet Union on the morning of August 18th, 1991. And as it happened, I left Russia, Moscow, in 1991 for America, for Brooklyn, where I grew up. And Russian law grants everybody who was in Moscow on August 18th, 1991, a Russian passport. So I became a Russian citizen by 11 hours, even though I'd left the country at 11 a.m. that morning. I had a Russian passport, which I only used to go to places like African places. I'm a journalist, and Tehran. The only time I've ever really used it was to go to Iran. It was a place you can't really go as an American. I grew up in the diaspora, and I went to France to study in my early 20s, and I met the love of my wife, the Ukrainian film producer Regina Davidzon, and I started living with my wife in Ukraine, and thus returned through my wife to my ancestral lands of Ukraine. Started living in Ukraine in 2010, spending summers there, covered the Maidan, covered the war, covered the cultural situation. In 2015, we founded a literary journal called the Odessa Review. It was, I think, a very fun and very sophisticated, beautifully bound print publication. It was extraordinarily expensive, and we lost our investor a ton of money. It was English and some Ukrainian stuff in it. I think I recall losing my investor 92 cents on the dollar, actually. It was almost a perfect record, right? It was a lovely magazine. We put out 13 issues of it, and eventually the company went bankrupt, as things do. Literary magazines do go bankrupt. That's the way of things. We returned to Paris, and I lived as a foreign correspondent for various publications in Paris, and then I returned to Ukraine in late 21, and I was there in early 21, waiting for the war to start, and I was there when the war started. I reported widely. I wrote pieces. I wrote op-eds. I produced films. I was a producer on Sean Penn's Zelensky documentary, which you can all watch on Paramount Plus. It's actually very good. It's a lot of fun. I'm in it. There's a scene with myself, Alan Cullison of the Wall Street Journal, Natalia Gumenyuk, everyone knows who Natalia Gumenyuk is, of the Diaspora, and Nolan Peterson, my fellow American, former Army guy who became a well-known correspondent. And we're sitting there on the 22nd of February, a night and a half before the war begins. We're all arguing whether the war's starting. It's obvious the war's starting, but I didn't. I was arguing that they wouldn't be taking Kiev, and I look like I have egg on my face in the film. I said, and I yelled at Sean Penn and Nolan Peterson, "Do you really believe Kiev's going to be on fire tomorrow?" Famous last words. So I reported from Ukraine, and I evacuated my own family, and that's my life. So I'm explaining that not out of solipsism, but because my background is not ordinary in terms of either the Ukrainian diaspora or the Jewish diaspora in America. It's just I'm an odd duck in that way. That's why I'm telling the story. I reported for 10 years on Ukrainian Jewish relations, on the Holocaust, on Andrei Shevchenko and the campaign to give him status as a righteous of a nation, for everything that he did to save Jews. If you don't know the story, I wrote a book for you. I reported on various funny stories like Dao, which was a really crazy film made by the Russian filmmaker Ilya Khrzhanovsky, who later became the artistic director of the Babyn Yar Memorial Center. A crazy story in the history of Jewish life and Ukrainian life and world cinema. You could read about that in this book. And I was deeply interested in the way that Ukrainians and Jews live together now. I talked to all sorts of people in both diasporas. I talked to Ukrainian Jews, and I watched the way that the Ukrainian political nation developed post-2014. So the thesis of this book, and it's actually in the title of the book, The Birth of a Political Nation, is that contemporary Ukraine, based in a liberal, democratic, and open idea of what it is to be Ukrainian, is par excellence a civic national state. It's a patriotic, healthy nationalism, which is not, for the most part, based in blood and soil nationalism, right? Throughout history, you've had two Ukraines. You've had the Ukraine of the titular nation, which was, the cultural Ukraine, and it's good. But in some ways, it's just like every other Slavic nationalism or nationalism, just a priori, in Eastern Europe. And there's the other Ukraine, which is the Ukraine of minorities, and the Ukraine of Bulgarians and Greeks and Russian speakers who don't want to live in Russia, and Jews, right? Hungarian Jews, big hats, Crimean Tatar Jews, silk brocade, kaftans, and Orthodox Jews wearing black hats and black kaftans. So in the tension between the two Ukraines, the Ukraine of liberal nationalism and titular nationalism, both of which, by the way, have a right to exist, right? They're different, but they're complementary, and they both have a right to exist. They're both good, right? If you go too far in the direction of deracination, that's bad. If you go too far in the direction of in-group relation, that also can become bad, right? So you have a kind of healthy tension between the two kinds of Ukrainian nationalism, which creates the modern Ukrainian political nation. And the thesis of the book is that Ukraine somehow, for whatever reason, turns out to be the most liberal nation, and liberal with a small L, democratic, in all of Eastern Europe. How this happens, why this happens, is something that I've thought about a great deal, and it's in the book. But when Putin, a dictator who controls a multi-confessional, multi-ethnic empire by force, starts this war against Ukraine, which is also a multi-confessional, multi-racial, multi-ethnic state, which is anarchic and not controlled by anybody. His arguments about Nazis, right? Everyone knows this. I very much feel, and I felt this as early as March 1st of last year, a week into the war, that one of the reasons that Ukraine survived as a political nation is that it was led by minorities. It was a government of people who come from the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, come from a more a more post-Soviet culture. Zelensky is the first post-Soviet president, not only of Ukraine, but of any of the Slavic states in the post-Soviet space. Russia, Belarus, Moldova also, now they have Sandu. Ukraine is the very first person who grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? He listened to Britney Spears and Eminem as a kid. We know what his tastes are, right? For various reasons, we know what music he listens to. He listened to rock music. He listened to Eminem as a kid, right? He's the first representative of the Maidan generation who comes to power, and he's also a Ukrainian gentleman of Jewish descent. Now, I use those words advisedly because I once had dinner with him and talked to him about his background, and he's not particularly into the Jewish thing, and he baptized his kids, and he's a post-Soviet Ukrainian gentleman. But he happens to be 100% of Jewish descent. And this not only diffused all the lies and all the propaganda that the Russians were bandying about at the start of the war, but also it kind of mobilized a Ukrainian political nation who, had a defense minister at the start of the war who was Jewish, and who have a defense minister now who's a Crimean Tatar. We have multiple members of the government who are Russians, who are of Bulgarian stock, tons of Crimean Tatars in this government, by the way, at all different levels, right? They have to survive. They're in the long term. They're the long game to survive the Putin regime. But again, this government is a government of Russian speakers, and Zelensky's not even particularly comfortable with what it might mean to be Ukrainian until the war starts. In the same way that he's not even particularly comfortable with what it means to be a Jew, right? He leans into both his Ukrainian civic identity and into his Jewish identity when the war starts. He goes on TV and speaks directly to the Russian soldiers. He says to them, he never quite says, "I'm Jewish" on television. He has never done that. But he said it as openly as could be expected. He made jokes during the campaign. Poroshenko, I'm going to sick my Jewish mother on you if you stop behaving badly. And he goes on the 22nd, 21st of February on TV, and he says to Russian soldiers, "Please don't do this. What kind of Nazi am I? What kind of neo-Nazi government am I leading when my grandfather and his brothers perished in the camps or fought in the Red Army to liberate those camps," right? So he, in a very fascinating way, he becomes both a Ukrainian, and he starts speaking Ukrainian on television, and starts thinking of himself as the leader of a Ukrainian nation, which is not just post-Soviet, right? But actually just a Ukrainian, and also leans into his Jewish identity. I always make laughs with Israeli politicians when I tell them, usually it's the Israelis who are shaming people into helping them through Holocaust memory. He gives a speech to the Knesset, hoping for the Israelis to provide assistance, ammunition, anti-drone stuff, anti-rocket, Iron Dome stuff, and he shames the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli Parliament, with his Jewish identity. Usually, it's the Knesset who's shaming people with Holocaust memory. It's funny. It's a Jewish joke. It's fascinating. You have a head of state who's a minority, and it's part of a reason that the nation, I'm sure of it, kept together for the first 3 months when it was not obvious that Ukraine would survive as a country. That will now, obviously, right? The Russians can't destroy it. Whatever the final territorial configuration of Ukraine will be at the end of this war, and I hope we have every little piece of it. It will survive one way or the other. That was not apparent in the first 3 months of the war. It could have gone either way. The Russian battle plan was actually not as stupid. It was sloppy and logistically, a bad idea, and they didn't use enough forces. But the battle plan actually wasn't as bad as we all think now, in retrospect, right? They could have succeeded in destroying the state. The state was able to mobilize everybody, partly because it was very much not asking the question of who's Ukrainian. Are you from here? Yes. Were you born here? Yes. Do you believe that this country should go on? Yes. That's okay. You're Ukrainian. We don't have what they in poli-sci call deep identity structures, thick culture structures, right? Those cultural questions were not being asked at the time. They will be asked after this war is over. And there'll be a lot of questions to be asked at the end of this. But the fact that you had this minority government composed of people from all over Ukraine, who, especially from Russian-speaking backgrounds, I do believe that this is what kept the country from being destroyed. So that's one thing that this book deals with. I deal a lot also with Russian propaganda. There's this really amazing thing in Eastern Europe where the Russians and the Hungarians and the Ukrainians and the Poles kind of argue about who loves their Jews more. It's kind of a weird thing, right? Like all these countries who have complex relationships to World War II and have all, to one degree or another, have dark histories in World War II. All of them strive to not be anti-Semitic. Ukraine, actually, according to all the polling, has the least amount of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, from Serbia up to Lithuania, from the Baltics to the Balkans, all across Hungary and Poland. The actual number of anti-Semites is the least in Ukraine. And I think that has something to do with the fact that Herr Hitler was not successful in bulldozing the demographics of the country, right? Poland is a nation that doesn't really have minorities. One nation, one language, one culture, one church. Poland is like 97% Polish, right? Most people are Catholic. The minorities were either killed by the Germans or expelled, understandably so, after the war. All those ethnic Germans were sent packing back to Austria or Germany, and the Ruthenians. We all know the history of the exchanges with the Soviet Union, population exchanges. A terrible history, but the outcome of it is that Poland is completely heterogeneous as a country, right? Ukraine is a country of many different kinds of people, which is its strength. And it's also the reason that, unlike Belarus and Russia, no one was able to dominate it completely in the tenebrous 90s, right? In 94, in Belarus, everyone knows, Lukashenko comes to power and doesn't allow for transition from communism and de-Russification. And the Russians, of course, have terrible 90s and yearn for order, and they bring this KGB thug to power, consolidates force, and also no transition to modern life, no psychological processes dealing with trauma, no decommunization, no dealing with all the bad things that happened and were done by Russians to one another in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. Whereas the Ukrainians, for whatever reason, and partly because so many different kinds of people live in Ukraine, want to go forward into the future, right? Ukraine is very healthy in that way, in the way that Russia and Belarus are not, right? I deal in the book a lot with memory politics. What does it mean that there are statues going up to Stalin and Lenin in Russia, while this Lenin statues are going down in Ukraine? What does it mean when there are statues going up to collaborators with Nazis, who are of course a tiny minority of the population, right? Millions and millions of Ukrainians fought in the Red Army or partisan units against the Germans, right? Which is something I always try to explain to Jewish audiences when I talk to them. There's obviously a lot of bad blood historically, and they'll say, people in my diaspora will say to me that there's a very bad history of collaboration of the Nazis, and I explain to them that first of all, the Ukrainians were not in control of their own state, unlike Vichy France or the Dutch, right, or Spain or Croatia, right. And I also explained to them that the number of collaborators was minuscule compared to the millions and millions of Ukrainians who fought in the Red Army or in the OUN against German formations after 41, or in the partisan formations, right? So there's a lot of that there. There's stuff in here about the Yiddish revival. There is a lot about Israeli-Ukrainian political relations, something I really am interested in, write a lot about. And there are also very funny stories at the end. There's a chapter in the end called The Jewish-Ukrainian Gothic, which is basically like surreal stories of the new Ukraine. So the first one is about my friend, the chief rabbi of Ukraine, Rabbi Bleich. I don't know if anyone knows this surreal story, but you know there is a Ukrainian church council, right? Everyone knows this, right? There are 18 people on it. 15 of them represent different Christian faiths: Baptists, Evangelicals, Greco-Catholics, Catholics, Russian Church, Ukrainian Church. There's 15 like different kinds of even Jehovah's Witnesses. A lot of different kinds of Christian clergy on this church council. There's two imams. One represents the ordinary Turkic community, and one represents the Crimean Tatars. The 18th person on the Ukrainian Church Council is my friend Rabbi Bleich. So Rabbi Bleich, as it happens, they take turns being the secretary of the council. They just draw straws, and 6 months at a time they're the secretary of the council, and they meet and they have meetings. As it happened, when all that stuff was going down in 18 with the Ukrainian church separating from the Russian church and getting a tomos. Everyone knows. Maybe my Jewish friends here don't know about autocephaly and what a tomos is, but basically, without going to too much theology, Ukrainian clergy needed basically a writ in order to be separate from the Russian church, which they'd wanted for a long time, and it comes from Byzantine clergy. In Istanbul, it's Byzantine in every sense of Byzantine. It's very complicated. It comes out of Byzantine Empire, and it's very political. So the Ukrainians had wanted for hundreds of years to separate from the Russian-led church, and so here they are getting their tomos, and they need a signature from the church council on the official documents. It just so happened that Rabbi Bleich had to sign off on the tomos, right? Is that insane? Is that funny? Like after 500 years of trying to get autocephaly for the Ukrainian church from the grasping claws of Moscow, you have a rabbi sign the paperwork, right? And so that's a piece in the end of the book, and Rabbi Bleich even calls me. He says they knew bad stuff was coming down, so they had a rabbi sign the autocephaly papers, right? It's very funny. It's also like a historical thing about Ukraine now. It's just, like a very funny story which explains where we are now. The next piece after that in the Ukrainian Gothic chapter is 3,000 Hasidic Cossacks congregate on the Ukrainian border. I often go along with my Jewish compatriots and friends to Uman, which is where Jews go to pray. It's kind of the Jewish Burning Man. I was just there with my friend. Yeah, I was just there with my friend Loser Tursky, the actor who played his great ancestor in. Anyone see the film Dobush yet? You know about this film? Yeah. Yeah, you saw the film. Do you remember the scene where the Jewish Vebesht, the Baal Shem Tov, is hanging out with his great friend, the Robin Hood, the Ukrainian Robin Hood, right? And they become great friends, right? It's a real historical thing. I went with my friend who played the Baal Shem Tov to Uman to look for his long lost kids. I'm writing an article about this. He got divorced as a 21-year-old kid, and he wasn't able to see his two kids for 17 years because of the divorce proceedings. And we went to look for his kids on Uman on Rosh Hashanah Eve. It was a very beautiful thing. He actually did find them. And so every year, Jews from all over the world come to Uman to pray, to party, and hang out. And in 2000, it so happened that Ukraine Ukraine closed the border because of COVID for everybody, and they still wanted to go and hang out. They're mystics. They don't care about COVID or closed borders, right? And so they decided to go through Belarus. But Belarus, in that time, right, as Rosh Hashanah starting in September, was in the midst of a revolution. Anyone remember that? Right? I was covering it for Foreign Policy magazine. And there's this very surreal moment when the Ukrainian Interior Ministry just closes the borders, does not allow anybody in and out unless they're a Ukrainian citizen or residency holder. And all these Orthodox Jewish guys went in through Belarus, through the Belarusian border, and they were trying to get into Ukraine, into Uman, in order to go pray and hang out and have their big yearly party. And at that exact moment, as they're in the no man's land between Belarus and Ukraine, when the Ukrainians closed the border, the Belarusian authorities claimed that the Lithuanians were going to start a war, a NATO invasion of Belarus, and they closed the entire border. And so you have this surreal moment when all these Orthodox Jewish guys got stuck in the no man's land between Belarus and Ukraine, and both countries had closed their borders to everybody. This is like a week-long period when you could not enter either Belarus or Ukraine. So they get stuck in these Orthodox Jewish guys. They get stuck in the no man's land between Belarus and Ukraine, and they really want to go to Rosh Hashanah to pray. And the Belarusian border guards won't allow them in because they're expecting a NATO invasion from Lithuania. They're stuck in this no man's land, and they really want to go to Uman. So they're thinking, what do we do? How do we convince the Ukrainian authorities? And this plan is brilliant and genius, but it didn't work. But they decided to dress up as Cossacks and sing in like lilting, broken Ukrainian with a Hebrew accent to the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. And they dressed up in Cossacks. I don't know where they got them, in Cossack suits and red. And they were playing their guitars and trying to serenade the Interior Ministry troops and President Zelensky to let them go to Uman. Completely surreal story, a real story. I know for a fact because I was reporting from Minsk and I saw all these guys in the Minsk airport. It didn't work. Great story, it didn't work. It's a great story. And then the final episode, because the book went to press right when the war began, and so my writings post-war, after about April of last year, aren't in the book. The last piece is called Two Jews, a Nazi, and a Russian. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but 1 year exactly before the war began, Zelensky closed down Novichok's TV stations, right? Mm-hmm. It's actually a very, very bad thing to do. Poroshenko's MPs often argue to me persuasively that Zelensky was not as good at kicking the can of Russian invasion down the street as Poroshenko was. So Poroshenko, for whatever his flaws were, he was very good at one thing, which was assuaging Putin's ego and kicking the invasion, which was probably always going to happen one way or another. It was going to be an operatic denouement between Russia and Ukraine, mostly because Putin is obsessed with Ukraine, right? It's always going to happen. But the Poroshenko people, they have a good argument, his MPs, that Poroshenko, whatever his flaws are, and they of course exist, you all know this, he was very good at kicking the can down the road, you know? Zelensky didn't bother to do that, right? Neither probably did they do very much in preparing the country for the war, and they had a very good argument that they didn't want to terrify the population into running away. They had a very bad situation. On the one hand, if they prepared the country for the war, they would have been better prepared for the war, which they were not. On the other hand, if they started doing that, the population would have fled and the economy would have collapsed. So I would not want to have been in Bankova making a decision about what to do with that. But anyways. But the article begins with actually, I can read a little bit. I'm just going to read a little bit so you get a sense of my prose. and maybe we'll just have a little conversation afterwards. You can ask me questions. So this is it was a very surreal moment in that on February 2nd, 2021, as the world's attention was largely elsewhere, the administration of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky decided to shut down 3 pro-Russian TV channels, which represented the views of the opposition platform political faction headed by pro-Russian oligarch and political proxy Viktor Medvedchuk. We all know who Mr. Medvedchuk is. Some of our Jewish friends might not know that he was also as a young man, he was the defense counsel of poet Stus. Yeah, and he was supposed to defend Stus, but he was of course already a communist apparatchik in his 20s, and he got this great poet into the gulag. Horrible person, of course, right? He was a horrible man at 26, and he was still a horrible man in his 50s and 60s. Years later, he would eventually flee, he'd be captured, and then handed over to the Russian government in exchange for a couple of hundred Ukrainian VIPs and POWs. And of course, he's now out of the system, and there are no pro-Russian political parties or proxies anymore in the Ukrainian political system. Whatever happens after this, the Russians will have zero internal leverage, right? We all know this, right? The war, 21 to 22, de-Russification happened under Zelensky, and the war essentially had the kind of radical and unexpected effect of de-oligarchizing the country, right? The oligarchy is no longer a political force within the country. How that all plays out after the war is going to be remarkably interesting, but the war essentially was the final nail in the coffin of destroying the oligarchy's power within Ukraine. So that's just a little tangent. Striking decisively using a legal pretext, Zelensky announced. By the way, I was against getting rid of Medvedchuk's TV stations, partly because it was obvious that it would piss Putin off, and partly because they didn't bother using proper legal reasons to do it. They should have had like a 2-year-long process to do it instead of using counterterrorism laws. I'm in favor of getting rid of Medvedchuk from the Ukrainian political system, but it should have been with a much more lawyerly pretext. That's just my own personal opinion. Striking decisively and using a legal pretext, Zelensky announced 5-year-long sanctions on the opposition platform MP Taras Kozak, who was the nominal owner of the 3 television news channels that pipe pro-Russian political viewpoints into Ukrainian homes every night, thus spreading an unabashedly pro-Russian message widely viewed by many to be noxious propaganda. While endorsed by the U.S. State Department and the British, the government's move was seen by some critics as a systematic attack on freedom of speech within Ukraine, even as the move also represented a policy that many Ukrainians had long ardently called for. Again, it should have been done. It should just have been done with more lawyerly finesse, right? You allow people free strikes, they can appeal it. You still do it, but it should have been done in a more... Yeah, finesse is the right word, that's right. The broadcasting licenses of the television stations were suspended based on the argument that Kozak was engaged in funding terrorism, that he was making money off the illicit coal trade that was taking place of a so-called separate... Political ratings have been declining rapidly, and his government is viewed by many observers as having lost momentum. Remember, I wrote this piece in February of 21, exactly a year before the war, and he was, of course, tanking in the polls, as all Ukrainian presidents do 2 years into their administration, because Ukrainians are never happy.
I'm happy.
This gentleman looks really happy. Maybe it's because you live in Canada. Some recent polls have indicated that disappointment with Zelensky is so acute that he would possibly lose a head-on presidential election to a candidate fielded by the opposition bloc. Something, therefore, needed to be done about Medvedchuk, who had been tolerated for a long time despite being by any objective standard on the side of Moscow in the conflict,
and representing the Kremlin's interests inside the country. Now again, there was an argument to be made that you have to talk to somebody, and the Russians didn't have an ambassador inside the country, right? So that's an argument. It's not a nice argument. It's not a humane argument. But he had a role to play, and his constituents, maybe not our sort of people, but had Ukrainian passports and had to be dealt with, right? Again, don't like Medvedchuk. Glad he's gone. Horrible man, but politics is complicated. Medvedchuk's ties with Russia have at times been useful to Ukraine. Former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko had relied on Medvedchuk to transmit messages to Russian President Putin, and the oligarchs seem to have arrived at some sort of private understanding with the Russian strongman. The nature of that arrangement remains unknown, even to the best connected analysts of Ukrainian politics. Others have argued that even as Medvedchuk represents an undeniably sinister influence inside the country, he does have the ear of President Putin, thus making him a legitimate interlocutor after the country had gotten rid of the Russian ambassador. The argument that Medvedchuk's television stations constitute a literal and existential threat to the integrity of the state, arguably quite true, remain in direct tension with legitimate concerns about the right of freedom of speech, including of the small and smaller self-identified Russian minority inside Ukraine. The American embassy in Kiev publicly backed the move, which indicates that it was clearly made in consultation with the Biden administration of the State Department. That the banning took place without recourse to a public set of justifiable procedures and escalating warnings, let alone anything resembling an appeals process, means that the decision will probably be challenged in the courts. The war put an end to that. It was not challenged in the courts. On Wednesday, the 3rd, 2021, the day after, that is 1 year and 3 weeks till the war, the day after the announcement of a television station ban, the leadership of the Yacht Bloc formally accused the Ukrainian government of being fascists. Standing on the podium of the Ukrainian parliament and flanked by Medvedchuk himself was MP Vadim Rabinovich, a leader of the opposition Platform for Life party, declaring full-on war on the government. Speaking in what one could only suspect was purposefully and artfully mangled Ukrainian, Rabinovich announced that the pro-Russian faction of the Ukrainian parliament would be initiating impeachment procedures against President Zelensky for his mockery of the voters of Ukraine. The threat of impeachment being bandied out by Rabinovich and the pro-Russian factions was almost certainly an empty threat. They have 10% of the seats of the Rada, far short of anything needed to impeach a sitting president. On the other hand, there was the remarkable fact that one of Ukraine's highest-profile Jewish politicians, the president of the All-Ukrainian Jewish Congress, was accusing the president of Ukraine, himself a gentleman of Jewish descent, of being a modern-day purveyor of the National Socialist Creed. Think about it, right? You have a man who won 2% of the vote in the 2014 elections, who was openly Jewish, accusing Ukraine's Jewish president of being a Nazi, right? Weird. The assembled Ukrainian parliamentarians cackled at Rabinovich as he delivered a flamboyant screed composed one part bathos, one part nostalgic Soviet resistance rhetoric, and 2 parts slapstick comedy routine. So I'll do my best, Rabinovich. Today, the face of fascism in our country has shown its true color. Green. Green is you all speak Ukrainian Russian, right? Our fathers and grandfathers in their own time, they stopped fascism. Now it is we, their defendants, who will do the same. We will triumph. No passeront, fascism will not pass. With a perfect final flourish, he began screaming, "You will all die, you are the devil, fascist devils." At which point he began belting out the first couplet of a booming World War II anthem, the Sacred War. Stavai, strana velikaya. At which point the entire Ukrainian parliament just starts cackling, right? It's stand up our great country, Stavai, strana velikaya. He starts just singing Soviet World War II anthems. Everybody was laughing, it was hilarious, right? The bravado performance brought the house down. Rabinovich is admittedly one of the most colorful politicians in a nation where the competition in that department is extraordinarily steep. He was banned from entering the United States, and I think Canada also, for many years for drug deals and weapons deals. He also received 2% of the national vote during the 2000 presidential elections when he ran on, ironically, on a campaign platform of proving to the world that Ukrainians were not anti-Semitic or fascist. And I remember a lot of, like, even right sector guys in 2014 who were going to vote for Poroshenko anyway, but they decided to tactically vote for Rabinovich in the first round of the election so they could prove that they weren't fascists. Right? This is amazing, right? You had like right sector guys and Azov guys in 2014 who were tactically voting for Rabinovich before they could vote for either Yulia or Poroshenko in the second round to prove that they're like nice liberal Democrats and they had philo-Semitic credentials, which is hilarious, right? So in 2002, the German news magazine Der Spiegel publicly accused Rabinovich of selling a shipment of T-62 Ukrainian tanks to the Taliban. He denied it, of course. The lawyers made me put that sentence in there in order to say that Der Spiegel said it first, not our magazine. That sentence went in there because of the lawyers. I've seen the documents, by the way. He was selling Ukrainian tanks to the Taliban before it was cool. Before it was cool to leave American tanks in Afghanistan to the Taliban. He was like a tank hipster. He was selling them to the Taliban, right? Way before it was cool. So let's skip to the end of it. But Rabinovich's speech belongs in a category of its own. One that sounds more like the punchline from a hereto undiscovered short story by Shalom Aleichem. Where can a Jewish parliamentarian call his country's Jewish president a Nazi in the name of Mother Russia? Only in Ukraine, my children. Only in Ukraine. So. Let's have a little conversation, a dialogue, debate, argument, whatever you like.
Well, to start the conversation, I have a question first,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, in your book, you noted that the Jews have been central to the Russian narratives and propaganda in interpreting Ukrainian history. Well, has anything changed in that regard during the last decade or so? What do you think?
Last decade or last 2 years?
Oh, whatever you
So, as there are fewer survivors of the Holocaust, and there are fewer people with us now who are alive in World War II, the memory politics becomes all the more important. There are almost no. You have to be 100 years old to have fought in World War II now. We're at the point where people were 20 years ago, where we're seeing articles in the world's newspapers. The last French soldier from World War I dies. The last German soldier from World War I dies. The last American veteran of World War I dies. We're going to be there in 5-10 years. We're going to see these articles. The last Canadian to have fought on the beaches of Normandy dies. The last French Jewish man in Auschwitz dies. We're at the very final moment when you can still meet people who were there. And a lot of them are in their 90s. And if they'd actually fought, they're 102 years old, 105 years old. People don't really live that long. Those are exceptions to how long people live, right? People, especially if they fought, they don't live that long. The debates become ever more noxious, interesting, important, etc., as we're farther away from the time, right? As we get away from actual lived memory of World War II, of the camps, of who did what, there is less historical memory in the population, right? There's just people know less. We're not going to go into what happened to the Speaker of this country's parliament. It's a very interesting and complex thing. We can talk about it. It's interesting, but whatever. But the point of that story was that there was just no historical memory, right? It was as a Jew whose family is in Ukraine, was just like it was not great to put up OUN soldier like that because it's just bad for our propaganda. I want to win a war. I don't care what people in Canada think. Like I don't need to prove or disprove anything about Holocaust memory. I just want to win the war, right? It doesn't matter to me what that gentleman did, who he fought for. It was just bad move politically, right? It fed into the Russian narrative. I'm just very pragmatic about that. I want to win the war. I don't want any more of my friends or cousins or relatives or whoever to die, right? The World War II memory politics is central, absolutely central to keeping the Russian regime together. Putin has not provided anything of substance in 10 years. The social contract, which kept Russia together the first 10 years of his, first 15 years of his reign, is now past its sell-by date. All they have, not going into the future and not offering any more gains for the middle class, is World War II politics, right? The myth of the Great Patriotic War, Russians as victors of World War II, which is of course nonsense. I'm a Ukrainian Jew. My grandfather was born in Uzbekistan. He was a Jew in the Ukrainian 60th Division on the Eastern Front. Ukrainians fought, Tajiks fought, Russians fought, all men and women from all 15 Soviet republics fought, and yet the Russians claim the victory is their own, right? They do so because they can get away with it, because of lack of historical understanding and historical acuity amongst diasporas everywhere, and also because they literally have nothing else to offer their population, right? This is like this is just their bread and circuses when they have nothing to offer. The annexation of Crimea was, let's face it, massively popular amongst the Russian electorate. And Putin got about 3 years worth of polling boost out of it, maybe 4. And he gets more and more crazy and more historically oriented and more obsessed with the past. In a metaphoric, metaphysical sense, he's the last generation of Homo Sovieticus who will rule Russia. Whatever happens next will be someone from either Petrushev's son or someone in their 40s or 50s. It'll be someone Zelensky's age, right? So, in this way, before the last generation of Soviet men who rule Russia go off into the final sunset, they're becoming more obsessed with World War II memory and policy and Soviet historical discourses. So, not only has it not gotten better in the last 10 years, and it's a wonderful question, it's actually gotten worse as they become more obsessive about Ukraine, as they become more inward-looking, as they become more cynically invested in the dialogue because they have nothing else to offer their voters, right? And they go all in on this propaganda, right? It's very sad. And it's only going to break in the long term when all these Soviet oldsters die out. No offense, if anyone here associates themselves with being a Soviet oldster. It's just you just have to wait until that generation of Russian citizens in their 70s and 80s who this works for die out, and it's just a matter of time, right? Not to be too controversial. I know this is Canada. I have to be nicer, right? Turn off my Eastern European misanthropic edge, right? Any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Just picking up on your comment of demographic change.
Yep.
Generational. Josaphat came to seniors home.
Great man.
Involved in about 4 years ago, pre-Zelensky election, pre-war, and he said 2 things. One, he said that corruption in Ukraine will not finally end until the generation that was born after the fall of the Soviet Union comes into power, comes into government, comes into positions of responsibility.
Sure.
Which is pretty well Zelensky's, not him necessarily, but the generation, his fellow Rada members.
Yeah. They're lovely, by the way. I know many of them. I know many of them. They're absolutely lovely people. They're 30s, late 30s. It really is a post-Soviet generation. People who are like me, born in the 80s. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
That's one thing he said. The second thing
yes.
Stayed with me was that you cannot wrestle independence from imperial power. It will never give it independence to you. Only blood has to be spilled. And Ukraine did not spill blood to get its independence. And so now, the blood is being spilled, and now it can become truly independent. So what do you think of his comments on both ends? What do you...
Those are great comments. Let me just start with the beginning of the book.
The beginning of the book is my very long essay, which was the cover essay of the Jewish Quarterly, the 70th anniversary of the Jewish Quarterly, which was last year, and it was an entire book-length essay. It's about 50 pages. It was 14,000 words on the history of Ukraine from Baal Shem Tov to Zelensky. It was really hard to write because there's so much there, and I was really having a lot of trouble writing it because it took 2.5 months to write this essay because there's a lot there. And at the end of it, my British Australian editor, who's a Jewish guy, was just tearing his head out. He says, "If I don't have this in a week, we're not going to go to press. Vlad, I haven't missed an issue since Hitler." So I got the essay in, and this is one of the very first sentences. It's a preamble to the second paragraph. The war to escape Russian domination, it turns out, had merely been put off for several decades. In September 22, the Jewish-Ukrainian businessman Viktor Kostyuk opened his annual star-studded Yalta European Strategy political conference in Kiev by explaining to the assembled dignitaries that the Ukrainians had been operating on a false assumption that they had actually won independence. We thought, this is me quoting Pinchuk, it was absolutely correct, and this is an insight that he steals from Sergei Plokhy, by the way. We thought that we had gotten independence in 1991, but it turns out that we had only gotten it formally. It is a very expensive thing, independence, and it works only if it is paid for in full. The breakdown of the empire has not really happened yet, and a dinosaur can take a very long time to die. So, you're not the only one, and Zizzles is not the only one to have that insight. We, by we, I mean all of us who were born in the Soviet Union, some of you here, avoided what happened in Yugoslavia, and what happened when the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved and the Ottoman Empire dissolved. The Yugoslav people, they went to war with each other. They started killing each other. And all of us thought, Ukrainians, Russians, Jews were all intermarried, right? We're not going to kill each other. And the Yugoslavs were also intermarried, right? Turns out that we had just put off those wars that really could have and should have happened in the early 90s for 30 years, right? And it's a sad thing, but it turns out that independence is earned with blood. That is the case. And it is even sadder for me as a Jew because this is the first time in 100 years when Jews are on two sides of European wars. We haven't seen Jewish officers killing each other since World War I, when there were Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire fighting, Jews in the German army fighting, Jews in the French army fighting, Jews in the Russian Imperial Army fighting each other. It's a really, really, really terrible thing. Same thing with Ukrainians. I always get so depressed when I hear the mayor of some Russian city with a name like Kramchuk say that the Ukrainian oppressors are firing at us again, and the SBU officer making a press statement about it has a name like Boyko or like Stepansky or something, right? There are a lot of people with Russian last names killing people with Ukrainian family names in the Russian army. It's really sad. I mean, it shouldn't be happening. Why is it that all the most anti-Ukrainian people in the Russian parliament have names like Kazakh? It's really not cool. I mean, we shouldn't be killing each other, and we are intermarried, and it's not great. Why is it that Putin's main guy in the Donbass file is literally named Kozak, right? And that there are Ukrainian patriots with Russian family names and Jewish family names, right? I don't think we should be killing each other, and this is Putin's fault that we are. So that's the answer to the second question. The Ukrainians did not pay for independence, and even until 2004, until the Maidan, the Ukrainian flag in Odessa before the Maidan, it was the flag of the titular nation. If you're running around with the Ukrainian flag or Vyshyvanka before 2014 in the south, where I'm from, in Odessa, you're kind of considered like a silly person or a nationalist person or like a little too much, right? That's because the symbols of the state after 2014, they were
embraced by only part of a population, right? After the Maidan, anybody from any part of Ukraine could pick up the symbols of the state, the flag, the vyshyvanka, and say, we're from here. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm of the titular Ukrainian majority. It just means I'm from Ukraine. I love this country, right? I remember 2015, there were 600 people at Vyshyvanka Day in Odessa. By 2021, there were 8,000, right? Every year, the number of people at Vyshyvanka Day in the middle of the summer was going up by a factor of 1, right? By the time the war started, it was almost 10,000. So the Jews are an important part of that process. As to your first question, I mean, like why is it that Ukraine is at the bottom of the anti-corruption indexes at African levels? Why is it? Why is it? I mean, I have a famous historian friend whose name will not be mentioned, a Western historian who I just saw at YES 2 months ago at the Pinchuk's YES conference, and he says to me, Vlad, explain to me, why is it that a country with white skin pigmentation has the corruption of Kinshasa? And he's British, so like, you know, it's a kind of a racy comment. You can't really get away with that kind of thing now, but no names will be named. But like, it's true. Why does Eastern European country have like sub-Saharan African levels of corruption? One of the answers is that is one way in which Moscow kept domination over Kiev for many years. From the very top, with oil and gas receipts, to the Yanukovych government, to other governments, all the way down to the local policeman who doesn't have enough money to gas up his own car unless he comes back with proceeds that he has to give to his captain, some of which his captain will kick up to the commander, some of which will go all the way up to the general of the police. All across every sector of the society, the corruption was endemic partly because that served Moscow's uses, right? Moscow liked that. Made them happy. That's one way you keep Ukraine from becoming a strong state, from building contemporary, liberal, democratic mechanisms, right? State mechanisms. That's how you dominate Ukraine. So the fight against corruption and the fight against the Russians and the fight against the communist past, it's the same fight, right? And you're absolutely right that it had to be someone from this generation. And some of Zelensky's young MPs and some of Agola's MPs, some of them are absolutely lovely, right? They're really nice people in parliament, in their 30s, educated. Some of them are completely random people, actually. It's an interesting thing about this government, that they put a lot of really random people in parliament. Some of them are completely random. Former wrestlers, former wedding photographers, guy from Odessa who represented my wife's constituency, a little tangent. He was just a bouncer at a bar. Okay? And he kept getting to fistfights once he got into parliament. He wasn't able, he couldn't transition into the next phase of his life, right? There's a lot of very random people in parliament, and maybe that's okay. Like the Zelensky people say that's the social lift. We have some random people in parliament from all sorts of random backgrounds who represent random people in the population. Not everyone needs to be a lawyer or technocrat or a soldier. But you have some really lovely people in parliament. There are about 10, 15 that I'm really, really, really impressed with. And it is this next generation that will, once you start taking money, it's difficult to stop, right? And a lot of these people, they don't even think that they're corrupt. They're like, I need a war chest in order to keep the other guy from destroying me, right? Even though they're stealing $1 billion. They need that $1 billion in order to keep the other guy or lady from coming to power and destroying them, right? So it has to be young people. And Ukraine kind of, Orange Revolution was not ripe yet. By 2014, the social function that needed to happen happened, right? And it took 9 years of creating state capacity, which is why the Ukrainian state was able to win. It hasn't won yet, but it survived in 2022 because that capacity had been built up over 7-8 years since the Maidan. bit by bit, anti-corruption scheme, and prozoro to prozoro, they built up that capacity, right? Any other questions? Ron, yes, sir.
One of the possible solutions to Russia's war on Ukraine is some kind of internal dissent, a la the Vietnam era in the United States, or some other explosion of the Russian Republic. Do you have a perspective on that? You got to.
Well, look, that's my other hat. As just a pure foreign policy journalist, a policy guy, and a think tank guy, and analyst. Just to take off the Jewish hat and the Ukrainian hat aside, just as an Eastern European guy. We have these arguments continually, and people always ask me this. Everyone always wants a prediction. In the beginning, everyone delusionally thought that the Russian state would collapse because of Western sanctions. Didn't happen. They've weathered sanctions very well, actually, very well. So all too sadly, they consolidated their regime. It is consolidated, and economically they were able to pivot. It's a big country, Russia, with lots of stuff in it. They are self-sufficient. The car industry collapsed, the airline industry collapsed, they don't have international banking anymore, but they can still make cheese. They still have steel plants, they can still make things. They are now self-sufficient. They don't need anything except imports for war from North Korea and Iran, right? Microchips, they can steal abroad. They buy up American and Canadian washing machines. They strip the microchips out, right? So we were delusionally thinking that the sanctions would make the regime collapse, or that the Russian people would come to the streets and fight. This was all wishful thinking, obviously. Plan C was that the Russian oligarchs, who lost between 30 and 80% of their net worth, depending which industry they were in, would rise up against Putin. They were no longer able to visit their houses in Italy, or send their daughter to school in Oxford, or go on vacation in wherever it is they go. They weren't able to see their Swiss banker or their bank account in Switzerland. Again, these people were all dependent on Putin, turns out. The very brave ones had already absconded, had been kicked out. The Khodorkovskys and Berezovskys had already been kicked out. Anyone below the age of Deripaska from the old regime came in the aughts as opposed to the 90s, and they did not have that internal drive to stand up to Putin, which is why they're there. They are mailable, as opposed to the ones who are out of the system, or dead, or in Canada, or America, or London, or France. So an oligarch uprising isn't in the cards either, right? Other people thought that the intelligence services would oust him. Hasn't happened yet. Other people predicted that there would be a collapse of the Russian state, that the Russian state would just break up into pieces. Hasn't happened yet. I don't know what it's going to take, man. I think people are saying on Twitter that he's dying, that Patrushev is giving these talks that he's already dead. Look, all the stuff about his oncological reports and that he has cancer, I don't believe it. I mean, he has more time than Ukraine does. He can grind out another 5 years easily. Ukraine can't. I don't see the regime collapsing. It would have collapsed by now. It's been 21 months. I don't see the Russian people rising up against him. I don't see the oligarchs and intelligence services rising up against him. We had a coup attempt with the Prigozhin uprising, and we've had some regional problems. This pogrom that was attempted in Dagestan shows that they're not in total control of their regions, and of course the Jews were the trigger for it. Could very well be that local regional elites say no to this, and they have a domino effect. Could very well be that the regional elites who are unhappy and their young men are getting kidnapped, Buryat young men, Dagestani, Chechen young men fighting in Ukraine, as opposed to Russians from middle-class families in St. Petersburg. Might be there that we see regional unhappiness coalesce into something. I don't see it. I mean, if I had to put my own money on it, this is going to grind out till until we see who the next American president is, at which point the Russians will make a deal with whoever it is comes to power. The Russians are gonna, and they're totally capable of fighting for another year, and the Ukrainians are just gonna have to grind it out for another year until we know who the next president is. I do not put my own money on a heart attack, act of God, Russian coup d'etat, or a mass проявление of conscience amongst the Russian people. I just don't. Sad to say. Hey, buddy.
So it seems to me that you're positing a kind of dialectic between this Ukrainian nationalism that contains all of these great tensions, and then of course the conflict with Russia,
Right.
which has actually been quite positive for unifying and channeling those tensions.
Correct.
Now you rightly are avoiding making pronouncements about what will happen, but the war is not going to last forever. Do you see Ukrainian nationalism as a kind of positive or as a productive kind of entity, as being in the future still contingent upon Russian hostility as a unifying force?
That's a great question. Thank you, Dr. Polanski. This is a great public intellectual we have here with us today.
I see the check cleared.
Look, any nationalism can curdle. If Ukraine loses this and loses it bad, it's not going to be a nice nationalism anymore. Partly it's a nice nationalism because we're winning, right? I don't think they're going to go after the Jews, and you know they're even within the military discourse. The military is obviously it's dominating the discourse in terms of history questions and memory policy questions in the war. It's not a kind of nasty discourse, and people are rightfully avoiding a lot of a very undiplomatic questions, which are inherently divisive, right? We should not be having a conversation about what Odessa is going to look like or which statues are going to go. I mean, obviously, Catherine the Great went down. Catherine II went down in the middle of a war because it's Russian imperialism. But like outside of that very narrow question of taking down statues of like straight up Russian empires, we should not be having cultural conversation questions in the middle of a war, right? It's because we are not having those questions that the army and the society is so cohesive. I think there are a lot of very smart people in Ukraine who have avoided those questions just because they're inherently divisive, right? We should not be figuring out what the country will be in the middle of a war. There'll be plenty of time after the war. I have a lot of even Ukrainian friends, intellectuals, who say that, like, you know, the Ukrainian political elites are delusional about the fact that Russia will not be here after the war. Russia's a very big country, and it's not going to go somewhere else. The Israelis live with the Arabs, right? They have to deal with them in 10, 20, 30, 50 years. Russia's not going anywhere, right? You're going to have to figure out how to maintain deterrence, how to make, obviously we're not going to go back very quickly to flights to Moscow, to trains to Moscow, to being on the same social media platforms, reading the same books. Part of the reason that the Ukrainians were so successful in building institutional structures was that they cut the umbilical cord of trade. They cut off flights to Russia in 2015. They cut off trains in 2017. They cut off social media in 2018. They cut off imports of books, film, all this. The single civilizational entity that was Russia and Ukraine. I'm not saying this to say that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. They're absolutely not. I'm saying this to say that there was no barrier between Russian and Ukrainian culture, right? The bookstores were full of Russian books printed in Russia. There was no Ukrainian film industry until 2014. 2015-16, the Ukrainians started making good films. I mean, Ukraine made like 4 films in 2014 and or 2013. And when Ukrainians watched films, they were films made by Russian film companies. They were watching Russian police serials. These really stupid, really bad CSI versions of Russian crime procedurals. That had to be banned in order to make all these old Ukrainian Soviet babushkas less patriotic towards Moscow. I mean, like, you know, banning things is bad, but that's a good thing to ban, if only on aesthetic grounds, right?
So, like, the Ukrainians have built national cultural structures. And Putin rightly sees that there's no going back to what was before, right? But whether Ukrainian nationalism will be based on an anti-Russian perspective, it's probably the case, right? Like you can't kill that many Ukrainians without a lot of people hating Russians. They rightly do. Will they be like the kids of Albanians or Serbs who only speak 2 languages as opposed to their father and uncle who speak 6? I mean, like it's better to speak. It is better to speak Russian because it's a regional language. You can go to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, or Moldova and meet people. On the other hand, the fact that lots of people speak Russian is a Trojan horse, right? So, you know, speaking more languages is better. Speaking less languages is worse. When a third of a population think of themselves as Russian, that's bad, right? Those people. I mean, you can even say that they're Russians living in Ukraine on Ukrainian territory with Ukrainian passports, right? Obviously, the war will change everything. Again, no predictions, but I would say that Ukrainization is going to take place very quickly in some places. Even in Odessa and Kharkiv, I think in 10 years, little Ukrainian kids won't know they'll know how to speak Russian, they won't know how to write it, because it won't be taught in school. I think it's a great question, man. Is that an affirmative? Is that like a satisfying answer? I don't know. I'm not even satisfying myself. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
My name is Klim. I'm son of Odessa.
Oh,
Yeah, I love this city.
great. You were born there?
Yeah, sure. And my first language was Russian.
Great.
I still speak Russian with my mom and etc. It's a huge problem nowadays with the language.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to shift to Ukrainian, but I can use it like the best way, like my first language, and etc. etc. But the question is not about that. So this war is unique. It's the first digital war,
Sure.
which we can see like online 24/7.
Absolutely.
And comparing to the Second World War, there are more ways how to spread the propaganda. And the propaganda is one of the hugest weapons in this war. And propaganda creates conspiracy theories, which is they create fear, and the fear creates hate, and etc. etc. So it's pretty important topic. And can you give a couple of advices how to fight with the propaganda, especially with your beloved people who are influenced by the propaganda? Because sometimes propaganda is more focused on the poor people with a lack of education.
Sure.
And one of the conspiracy theories closer to the topic of today's meeting is probably you heard about it. It's called, I think they call it the New Jerusalem, Sky Jerusalem. So it's a conspiracy theory that it's going to be created like from Dnieper to Odessa.
Yeah, it's completely
How to
completely
fight
same.
with them? Like on this example, how would you fight with this kind of a propaganda?
Thank you. First of all, lovely to meet you. In many ways, I'm in the same situation, needing to prove my Ukrainian from mid-level to excellent level. It's hard, actually. You know, when you're a native Russian speaker and you're married to a Ukrainian lady, and then you know, it's easy to get stuck speaking Russian, even with your Ukrainian friends. My Ukrainian's it's fine. It's like getting better, but it's you know, it's a universal problem in Odessa, actually. And I've seen a lot of this, actually, because a lot of the people who fled Odessa to Europe left their apartments, and a lot of the new IDPs come from Mariupol and from Kherson. And so you have a lot of these Russophone people from Mariupol and Kherson trying to speak Ukrainian. And it's very funny, because all the waiters in Odessa are from Kherson and Mariupol, because they fled, and they're all trying to speak Ukrainian. And then you'll see these middle-aged Odessans who learn Ukrainian in high school. They're both trying to speak bad Ukrainian to each other. You see a lot of this, like the guy ordering in pidgin Ukrainian, and the waiter trying to take the order in Ukrainian. And sometimes there'll even be kind of like urging each other, validating each other's Ukrainians, like, yeah, let's keep going. It's very funny, and it's part of this political process, right? I have friends from Ukraine, native Russian speakers from Odessa, who are native Russian speakers who do not speak Russian anymore, and had to learn Ukrainian. It was very difficult for them. I know some very prominent Ukrainians. One of them went to Harvard Business School, speaks beautiful English, like you and me. And he had to. It was very difficult for him when the war started. He had to just like sit there with a grammar book and learn Ukrainian properly. That's not everybody. Most people are actually quite lazy. And even in Odessa, there are a lot of people who hate the Russians but don't want to change the status quo, right? So Odessa will be kind of like for the next 15 years, 10 years, a box of Russophone culture. This conspiracy theory you're talking about. There are people who think that there are Jews who want to. This is completely insane nonsense. The Jews want to ethnically cleanse the lands of Ukraine and go back. This is nonsense. Like this is. I don't even know what to say to people like that. Like it's completely crazy. Dealing with conspiracies is very difficult online. The new technology is very powerful. People work on anti-conspiracy stuff. And it's always difficult because it always becomes very partisan. In America, we had an attempt to have a board of truth or something like that. It was quickly and rightfully nixed. There's no reason why we should have a disinformation board being funded by the American government on Twitter disinformation. It's a horrible problem. It's also propaganda. Propaganda is not new. It's something that you've seen throughout the history of time and throughout the history of war. Dealing with disinformation and propaganda on social media, especially on Facebook and Twitter, is extraordinarily difficult because it always winds up that one side in a political food fight winds up taking control of those mechanisms. So I'm actually, when Musk bought Twitter, it turned out that Twitter had been actually captured by people whose politics did not represent the politics of 95% of the American population. And we saw the internal emails for moderation. Moderation is very difficult, online moderation. People write books about this entire growth industry of conferences. I don't have an answer for this. Like content moderation is just a very difficult problem, right? I see David, you're nodding sagely in the background.
I wasn't going to chime in, but no. I mean, I think he did do us a great service by being able to open that up and be able to show just how kind of embedded in these things the American elements of the American state have become.
That's right.
I mean,
That's absolutely right.
if it were up to me, I would just have a crack team of ninjas taking out the 12 or so most irritating accounts.
Yeah, well, like when Musk opened up the Twitter files, it turned out that Twitter was continuously emailing with 9 government, like the CIA, the State Department. They were continuously emailing to the point where the State Department or the CIA or the FBI would be like, oh, this is disinformation, and 3 times that 5 would be something which would be Trump leaning or Trumpy or whatever. Like I'm not a Trumpist or anything like this, but like the capture of social media by legacy media people who had kind of mutated in this weird relationship with the intelligence agencies. The cure is as bad as the disease, right? I don't have a good answer for that. But when they tried to moderate, it would always wind up for some reason being Democratic, and I mean, I'm an American, Democratic political party hacks, emailing with their counterparts in the CIA and FBI and taking down accounts of people they didn't like with no, in the same way that like Medvedchuk's TV stations need to be taken out, and they were taken out under like political pretexts instead of in some more finesse way. It always turns out that some political hack in Twitter is emailing his friend at the State Department saying, this Hunter Biden stuff is a conspiracy theory, and then it turns out the Hunter Biden stuff is not a conspiracy theory. So I was a U.S. law enforcement witness on the Hunter Biden stuff. He's a scumbag. Like if it was me doing those things, I'd be in jail, right? It's horrible. And yet, content moderation is a very difficult thing. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you. Maybe one more question, and we'll wrap this up, and we can all hang out and sign books. Yeah.
I have a question regarding Israel and Ukraine.
Oh, such a great question. Good. Oh, great. I forgot about it. Great, thank you.
Israel is standing actually a little bit aside of this whole conflict and war in Ukraine, etc., trying to balance its position between Russia and itself. But in light of the recent events in the Middle East, would you think that Israel will be more engaged in closer relationship between Ukraine and itself?
Okay, this is great. I'm so glad you asked that question. I wrote an essay about this on October 24th in Tablet magazine. You can go back and read my essay in Tablet on Israeli, Ukrainian, Russian political relations. This is something that I've been obsessed with and deeply interested in for a long time. One of the essays in his book is when Netanyahu arrives in 2019 for a state visit, and he meets the young president-elect, the only other Jewish head of state in the world. Now Latvia also has a Jewish president, so we're Ukrainians and Israelis are not special anymore. Like Mr. Levitz of Latvia, who's a tremendous supporter of Ukraine and has on multiple occasions weathered bombs and gone in and showed his backbone, is the world's third Jewish president or head of state. So obviously, a little bit of deep background. I'll give like 2 minutes of deep background. The Ukrainians fell afoul of the Biden administration's and the Obama administration's needs the Iran deal. So as it happened, when the war began, and I do mean 2014, the Obama White House was engaging in back-channel negotiations with Tehran. Everyone knows this, right? The 2015 JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also colloquially known as the Iran deal, right? Everyone knows about this? The Iran deal was being negotiated at the same exact time that the Russians had annexed Crimea and had sent troops into eastern Ukraine. The Obama administration told the Ukrainians not to fight back. They told them to stand down. They said, we'll get this with sanctions, and they slapped the Russians on the wrist with very light sanctions, thus arguably incentivizing more violence against Ukraine. Nothing was done, if you remember. Now, again, I voted for President Obama. Cards on the table. I voted in 2012 for Obama. But let's be honest about what they did. They downgraded the Israeli relationship and upgraded the Iran-Shia axis. They downgraded Ukraine and they allowed the Russians to run rampant. Nothing was done to help the Ukrainians until they miraculously fought the Russians to a standstill themselves in eastern Ukraine, right? So the State Department sacrificed the Syrians and the Ukrainians to the JCPOA. What happened next was that the Netanyahu government, Bibi, needed a ceasefire with the Russians because they were keeping Hezbollah from the northern Golani Heights. What happened was that the Israelis were very skillfully kept out of the Syrian civil war, which was spiraling and combusting into a regional Arab-Iranian war, by making a deal with Moscow and Tehran. Right? Everyone knows this? Actually, maybe you don't know this because this is not so well explained in the media, a lot of whom are Democratic Party animals in America, in my own country, and who are on side with the JCPOA. People, unlike myself, have not really spent a lot of, my journalist colleagues have not actually spent a lot of time in Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East as I have. I've spent a lot of time in Iran and the Arab world and Israel and all over reporting. So people don't really understand that the Israelis needed Russia. They needed the Russians in order to keep the Iranians away from the Israeli border, and they needed permission to bomb Syria. So the S-300s and S-400s that Russia has a no-fly zone over most of Syria, are powered down whenever the Israeli Defense Forces need to bomb something in Syria, right? So there's a deconflicting line. Jerusalem will call Moscow, and they allow them, by they I mean the Russians, to bomb stuff in Syria. Proxies of Assad, Hezbollah proxies, the PLCs, the People's Liberation, whatever, the PLF's forces, which are typically Sunni militias, right? The Israelis keep the PLCs and the Assad forces away from their border. And the deal with the Russians was a deal of the devil, right? And partly it meant not engaging with Ukraine, even in 22. Partly meant voting with the Russians in the United Nations. Partly it meant not escalating the war and not engaging in fighting with other proxies who are fighting the Americans, right? We all hear about the Yemenites firing rockets at American bases continuously. You hear this, right? Oh, maybe you don't.
Yeah.
You do. So this was a very, very, very understandable dirty deal that Netanyahu made with President Putin. President Putin respects Netanyahu, and Netanyahu sees or saw his personal relationship with Putin as a national asset, a personal asset for him politically, and a national asset. So this deal held until October 7th, until exactly a month ago, right? October 7th is a world historical event. As it happens, my own mother was in southern Israel in Ashkelon when it happened. My mother survived. I'm absolutely livid. My mother was visiting our relations in southern Israel, who happened to be Ukrainian Jews from Uzbekistan, and Ukrainian Jews and Russian Jews in Ashkelon. Ashkelon is a Russian-speaking post-Soviet town. My mom goes there to visit her relations. So October 7th was this world historical inflection point. We're going to see how it plays out over months and years ahead. But one thing that it did was exposed the balancing act that Netanyahu was engaging in with the Arabs, the Iranians, and the Israelis. The only people who have friendly relations with all those groups of people who hate each other, and the Iranians hate the Arabs, and the Arabs hate the Iranians, and the Arabs hate the Israelis, and the Israelis hate the Iranians, were the Russians. It's a direct continuation of Soviet third worldist policy, right? So Putin did not call Netanyahu for 10 days after the massacre took place, even as young President Zelensky was one of the very first people to call Netanyahu and offer to come. That offer was denied for political reasons. Zelensky has not yet been to Israel, even though it would be a wonderful thing. And the Iranians are now in a transactional alliance with the Russians, right? We all know this, right? The Iranians are fighting the Israelis and the Ukrainians at once. Not only is this a civilizational war for democracy, but it's also a war against Iran, which is a Russian ally in bombing Ukraine. We know this, right? They're actually Iranian special forces troops stationed in Crimea. Did everyone know this? They're Iranian forces stationed on Ukrainian territory, directing their little drones to hit apartment blocks in Kiev and Chernihiv and Chernowitz and Kharkiv, right? So the Iranians are on side with the Russians fighting in Ukraine, and they're also the instigators of this butchery in southern Israel, which my mom survived, thankfully. So the Russians have humiliated the Netanyahu in his relationship with Putin, because they've downgraded the Israeli relationship, because they're fighting with the Iranians.
I think that's a very thorough answer, right? I'm hoping that Israel will drop its neutrality. I've published op-eds about this. I've lobbied people. I've talked to people. I'm really hoping that our Israeli friends understand that it's time to take a side in this war. The Israelis quietly helped with intelligence. They helped with some medical supplies. They absolutely helped with zero military stuff, especially the anti-missile rockets that they're so good at because they're continuously being fired at by the Hezbollah and Hamas guys, right? Some of their expertise on anti-missile technology would be very useful in Kiev right now, in Odessa right now. They've not exported any of that stuff because of, obviously, politics, which I just explained to you. I'm hopeful that the events of last month will change things. So let's leave it at that. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for your attention. I have only a couple of books left. I think I have like 8 books left if someone wants one. You have to pay for that.
I just wanted to ask you for 1 second. Thank you very much, Vladislav, for this wonderful talk, and Halyna Kostyuk for the introduction. I would like to thank our sponsors, Delta Bingo and Contact Ukrainian TV Network, and Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, Natalia Fedoschak, who's watching us on live stream. And I would like to call to the microphone Raya Shadursky, Executive Director of Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, to say a couple of words. Thank you very much, Raya.
Thank you very much. And Shalomni Hosti, honored guests, we certainly appreciate you attending today. We thank, where'd you go?
I'm here.
Certainly thank Vladislav for coming to Toronto. I understand this is your first visit here.
Ever.
First visit ever.
I've been to Montreal.
Oh, okay, different here. I just want to underline that UJE works with Vladislav over the past years, and we work with him today, and hopefully in the future. He's a unique journalist, and his work has added to our research of Jews and Ukrainians, both in Ukraine and in the diaspora. And if any of you are interested, on our website, UkrainianJewishEncounter.org, we have a section called Timeline. In there, you can go into a specific year, and you can then, with the information that'll pop up, will give you the political, the economic, the social events of what was happening during that time period. So you will see the relationship from antiquity to now on that particular site of the relationship between Ukrainians and Jews. So thank you very much. And
What do you mean, you don't remember?
Vladislav.
I'm here. Sorry. I'm here. So many.
I just want to
ADD, attention deficit disorder. Sorry.
Me too.
I want to thank you again, and I think we need more journalists like Vladislav to teach the journalists in North America a thing or two.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I didn't think people.
Just
get to the hotel and bring them. Go
Just
back to
a
the hotel
word
and bring them.
that thank you very much to everyone who came here, and we invite you as coffee and to talk to Vladislav, get your book autograph. Our next event will be December 3rd, is exhibit opening of Yakov Holovatsky, and December 10th we will have Marsha Skripuch, a Canadian author of Ukrainian background, presenting here her book about Holodomor. Дуже дякую всім, прошу до розмови.
Yes, sir.
This page is not here.
That one.